This is Transfiguration Sunday. It's the transition Sunday from a season of Epiphany, which is what we've been going through, and beginning of Lent. Lent starts this coming Wednesday, and then first Sunday of Lent is next week. So we're always looking at Transfiguration, and the Transfiguration is this really interesting story where Moses and Elijah appear, and Jesus' closest disciples are right there, and they say, "Let's build huts, let's build tents, let's worship you folks." They're up on a mountain. This is the place where mystical, magical, spiritual things happen. And God speaks and says, "Follow Jesus." And then poof, Moses and Elijah are gone. Now, how do we work with this story? It's one of those stories that is so familiar, it is poorly discussed. So we get that way with the Bible sometimes when we're so familiar with something. We've heard the story so often that we kind of brain check out. Or we're so used to the interpretation maybe from our childhood that our brain checks out in a different way. So let's unpack this one a little bit. Transfiguration in the story of Luke. First of all, transfiguration has been used historically in not that many generations ago and going backwards to suggest to Christians that Christianity is the completion of the Hebrew tradition, what became Judaism. So there really shouldn't be any more Judaism. It should just be about Christianity. That's hugely important that we debunk that one, because this is one of the stories that has been used to deeply hurt and justify horrible things happening to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And it's really important to remember this is the Gospel of Luke. So we're talking 80, 90 of the Common Era when this was first written. There was no historical Christianity as we understand modern Christianity. There was no historical Judaism as we understand modern Judaism. So if we remove the historical stuff and remove the fact that these things didn't exist at the time, Luke was probably trying to tell us a different story. And since this story appears in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was a really significant moment in the development of the Christian church. All the Gospels, to various extents, rooted themselves in the Hebrew tradition. Jesus himself rooted himself in the Hebrew tradition. He wasn't coming to make a new religion. His followers did that a century or so later. He was coming to adjust the tradition that he grew up in, the Hebrew tradition that he was part of in the Middle East. So he was not there to destroy the traditions that were represented by Moses and Elijah. And what were these traditions? Moses, of course, represents the laws. There was a tradition, historically inaccurate, but tradition nonetheless, that said Moses dictated the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. In the Hebrew tradition, the modern Jewish tradition, that's known as the law, where the Hebrews and the Jews base their tradition around what they're told. And that's the tradition that the Pharisees continued. And that's the tradition that around the time of Jesus, actually going back a couple of centuries before Jesus, that the Talmud, the Q&A part of the modern Jewish tradition was born. This assumption that we keep tinkering and we keep reinterpreting the laws based on where we are in the modern world. That's Moses represents. Elijah's a little bit different. So Elijah is the only person in the scriptures who actually doesn't die. We know Moses died. I have no idea where they buried him, but Moses died before he left. He could not cross into the promised land. Elijah, however, went up to heaven in a fiery chariot. So he didn't have the experience of death the same way that everybody else did. So that's why it was often Jesus was misunderstood for being Elijah, because the promise was Elijah was coming back. And if you've ever had the joy of participating in Passover Seder with Jewish friends, they always leave a table, a full set piece of at a table with an open chair for Elijah. And some traditions even have the door open so that Elijah can come in and join them. They're always waiting for Elijah to come back. So it was an easy connection, an easy mistake to think that Jesus was Elijah. And Elijah represents the prophets. So the people who were telling the Hebrews that we hear about in the Hebrew scripture that they're not living the way they're supposed to be living. And these are the prophets that told those in power, so kings, dictators, elites of any kind, you're not doing what God asks you to do. And we get through from Isaiah through to the end of the scriptures, we get a whole host of horrible things happening that God apparently has created simply because the people are not listening to the prophets. The prophets are also the read scripture in modern tradition. When guest speakers come, the prophet is the part they read. So these are huge, huge pillars of the Hebrew tradition and the modern Jewish tradition that we see represented in Jesus, in the Gospels. And the message is, of course, that Jesus is highlighted. Jesus' robes turn whiter, and he is identified as the one God picks, the Son, the one who is to carry on God's message. And then Moses and Elijah go away. So if it's not getting rid of Judaism, and it's not quite creating a new religion, what could be going on there? As we look at the scripture today, we need to look at what they represented in the Hebrew context, in the first century Palestinian context. See, the Hebrews were known as the people of the book, the people of the law. They had strict guidelines, in fact, a law for every bone in the human body that they were to follow, and that carried with them the tradition of Moses. When the Pharisees were going around and telling Jesus that he wasn't living up to the law of Moses, that was their job. That was the whole idea. In fact, the whole enterprise, they believed, would fall apart if you didn't follow the Hebrew laws and traditions. And Jesus got in trouble for that all the time. Now we have Elijah, who's one of the main things Elijah did, besides representing the prophets. Elijah told the king at the time, get rid of all this worship of Baal and any other god who is not the one God. Now, they didn't do it, and we have this wonderful story of Jezebel, and I certainly encourage you to look it up. But here we have Jesus coming in and essentially saying, don't worry about that. That is not a concern. That's not a distraction we need either. So don't be distracted by the laws. Don't be distracted by what other people are worshiping and doing. Don't bring it into our lives. It doesn't work. It doesn't matter here. The transfiguration, the transition that is happening here is we're going from a system of obedience to a system of social change. And that is really the beginning of the social gospel, which Luke does so well. And it's the beginning of how we see Jesus as he continues moving towards Jerusalem. Before this point in the scripture, we have seen healings, we have seen Jesus trying to talk to his family, we have seen him being kicked out, we have seen his temptation, we've seen all sorts of stuff that is really Jesus focused. The scripture today is actually followed by a healing, and I didn't look it up, but I'll have to. I think this is the first healing that Jesus does where he's not physically there. He says, the person away is healed, your son. And he makes that family whole again. And he lets them go off because their faith was enough. So that's the secondary message that this gospel is telling us, that Jesus is the choice. Not because the others don't matter, but because we're in a new world. We're creating a new existence now. That existence that is hands-on, human and God created. That Jesus is leading us to social change. Not to destroy cultures, not to destroy traditions, not to destroy anything religious. I mean, he's got his eye on the Romans for sure and the destruction they're doing. But he's not there to upset and destroy the Hebrew culture. He's there to enrich it. And when he sends this father and son duo away, he's also saying, I don't have to be with you in order for us to be community. That I am with you in so many ways. Physically isn't the only way. And he also talks with Elijah about what leaving would look like. So there's a hint to what the resurrection is going to look like. All of this is for us to realize it's transition time now. Jesus has a mission. Jesus isn't just there making everybody feel good or doing his thing. Jesus brought a new way of life. Jesus asked us to be part of something new. God identified Jesus not to dismiss anybody else, but just to say, this is what you're supposed to follow now. This is the message. This is the embodiment, the incarnation. This is what we're about. We need to internalize that. We need to realize that is what we're called for, especially on this cusp of Lent, where we are about to go through our own period of trial and self-focus and all those things that Lent brings, that deep delve into ourselves to kind of renew and refresh our sense of Christianity. But before we can go there, we have to be reminded that the person we're following, the Lord of it all, the one who essentially inspired the beginning of our tradition, gave an understanding of how we were supposed to live, how we were supposed to be, not getting caught up in laws, which is really easy to do, not getting caught up in fear of anybody else. That's also really easy to do. But to charge forward, to move forward with the vision of making something better. Now we have been positioned. Now we have been enriched. Now we, as followers, can start on that 40-day pilgrimage that will eventually take us through the darkness of Holy Week. We have everything we need now to start that voyage. Lent is such a significant part of who we are as Christians because it forces us to look internally, to look at our own faith development, to prepare ourselves for what Easter Sunday can mean. And before all of that, we now have the word from God. No confusion here. There's none of the asking questions that have happened up till now with Scripture. Jesus is the vision. Jesus is the one we're supposed to follow. You can still do the laws. You can still be wary of the prophets, but just don't focus on them. Don't obsess about them. Jesus is the focus. How Jesus lives, teaches, and dies. That is our inspiration.